May the words of my lips and the meditation of our hearts be always acceptable to you, O Jesus Christ, our strength and Redeemer. Amen. Won't you be my neighbor? Won't you be my neighbor? The sermon title that most everyone has heard before, because I believe at least everyone here has seen at least one, if not possibly way too many episodes of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And Fred Rogers was a pastor with the Presbyterian Church. And it is my belief, whether or not it was his specific intention, that over the course of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, what really we have play out every single episode is a children's sermon, a children's curriculum on this second commandment of the summary of the law. Love yourself as you love your neighbor. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. Because as you go through the episode, what happens every single time but some place where a child might find themselves having trouble loving themselves is brought up. And Pastor Rogers brings that child the process of how do you love yourself in the midst of this situation? How do you love yourself when things haven't gone your way, or when you've done something wrong, or when things are not happy? How do you keep loving yourself? And then along that same issue, whatever the issue of the day is, the next question, as we go into that land of make-believe, is how in the midst of that do we maintain, with some quite contrary characters, a love of neighbor, a love of the other, a love of people who at many times are awkward, are confused, are mean, are grumpy, not necessarily pleasant. So that when we come back out of that land of make-believe on the trolley, as we are back in this real world, we can perhaps learn some of the lessons we gained there. And I think for children, there's this long reality of Mr. Rogers just being this calming sort of, yes, that's how things work. There is nominally nothing very scandalous about Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, which doesn't mean that in its production there were not places of scandal. That in the creating of this show, there wasn't points where an episode got pushback from the producers and from audiences for being a children's sermon about loving yourself and loving your neighbor. One of the key episodes that caused turmoil was when a black character, the postman, was introduced into the midst. The police officer was put into the midst. And even more scandalous was an episode where Fred Rogers sat next to this black man outside in front of a kiddie pool, and they put their feet in that kiddie pool together. And there on national television, on the public broadcasting system, were white feet and black feet in a pool sharing the same water. And that was a request to be sitting, loving yourself and loving your neighbor, sharing water, sharing bathing, bathroom, water facilities that caused a scandal. And why was that? Because at that point in time, the idea of how we go about loving our neighbor and loving as ourselves in America still wasn't ready for the idea that white people and black people and Jewish people and indigenous peoples and Hispanic peoples and people who were basically not white and white people could put their feet in a kiddie pool together on public television, and everyone think, well, that's just neighborly. And this disconnect, which for Mr. Rogers' neighborhood is sort of curious and small, and Fred Rogers in his small way was trying to sort of look at that edge of where we actually have so much difficulty being neighborly. That difficulty we have as adults being neighborly is something that we continue to chew on, to have as gristle in our mouths, that we try to process and fail to consistently and constantly. We use this love your neighbor as yourself in this very platitude way. But when we look around at the world right now, what we have is consistent issues of having major problems with the idea of a black man and a white man just sitting with their feet in a kiddie pool on larger and larger scales. We can look to the fact that 20, 30 years ago, what was the border at Nogales, at Douglas? What was the market that happened at the San Miguel Gate on the Tohono O'odham Reservation, where a huge market would just pop up both sides of the border? And now that gate is closed. Now Nogales, at Douglas, in El Paso, we have long refugee lines. We have shelters here in Tucson. We have shelters on that other side of the border. And of course, this gets us to what is the neighbor relationship between Ukraine and Russia. And in the midst of what's happening right now, what is that neighbor relationship between the state of Israel, the people of Gaza, the people of Palestine? And how this phrase that we so often use as a platitude, love your neighbor as you love yourself, a systemic failure to be able to just figure out how to do that is clearly evident as we look around the world. And I think back to the very beginnings of the Zionist movement before World War II. It's almost entirely agnostic, generally atheist, secular Jews with a zeal for communalism, not outright communism, going into parts of their promised land that had been overrun by industrialization. Farmland that the British Empire had taken over from the Ottoman Empire that they were pretty sure was ruined for centuries. And these Zionists coming in saying, no, we are going to heal ourselves by healing this land. And they started a whole series of kibbutz, taking over land that no one else wanted, and slowly and painfully, only through support from the outside when it comes to basic foods and basic necessities, they were able to transform this land that was toxic into land that was nourishing. But then once they had nourishing land, the empire and their neighbors and the Palestinians said, wait, you have good land there now. How are we going to be neighbors? It was so easy to be neighbors when they were struggling to survive, but once they had prosperous land, it was like, wait, now who's going to control that which is prosperous? And then we have World War II. And then we have this huge question of who now is going to actually have the Jewish community as their neighbors, because we recognize they need a place to be. Before, England suggested, well, maybe we can do something with this land we just took over from the Ottomans. One actual possibility presented, well, what if we gave the Jews Alaska? And this was actually one of the first propositions, almost second ranked, before the idea of this creation of Israel as sort of an independent body. And then the navigation of how do you move an entire group of people who overwhelmingly need a home into a place where the neighborhoods that are desirable are already filled? How do you negotiate who owns what land when in many cases you're dealing with people who have lived in homes for generations that were owned by the Ottoman Empire, not in their own name, and now were owned by the British Empire, not in their name, and now were handed to a state they didn't necessarily have any say in the creation. And there have been times where there has been a chance to live into this commandment. There have been so many points and places and times in these relationships where this love for neighbor and this love for self did shine through. And there have been many, many points where this love for neighbor and this love for self has been a marked failure. And we get back to the Old Testament lesson we had today. We get back to the psalm that we had today. And what I think we need to most realize in the midst of looking at the conflict happening in the midst of Gaza and Israel, when we look at the conflict of what's happening in the midst of Russia and Ukraine, we look at the conflict happening not very far from this church at the border between Mexico and Estados Unidos. All the way back, what the Bible talks to again and again is how we as humanity struggle with this loving our neighbor as we love ourselves reality. And how when we fail to do that, things fall apart, lands get conquered, people die. And dire realities befall us. And that when we get it right, something can happen in our communities that is beautiful and amazing, but difficult to maintain. And in the midst of these conflicts, what we need to always remember is that it is our own tenacity in relating or failing to relate to this commandment that comes up again and again. And that we are all caught up in failing to do this in large ways and small ways. And that in the midst of whatever might solve this, the foundation which we always seem to lose is how simple it is for Fred Rogers to say, "Won't you be my neighbor?" How simple it is to show children, black feet and white feet, sitting in a kiddie pool together, and children saying, "Of course, that's obvious," not even thinking about how this could be scandalous. But as we build, as we grow, as we gain these identities of Palestinian, Gazan, and Israeli and Jew, as American or Mexican or Guatemalan, as Ukrainian, as Russian, as these identities want to not have neighbors but to have control, we lose something. And that when we look at Israel-Palestine, when we look at Russia and Ukraine, when we look at the own interrelationship between Mexico and the United States, we look at our own relationship of how, not very long ago, we were redlining districts and saying, here is where whites can live, and here is where everyone else can live. That this is all one great turmoil that we're all caught up in, of loving ourselves and loving our neighbors. And that we each have a choice pretty much every day about what way we're going to go. And that this isn't some simple platitude. This isn't something easy. That really we have to sit there and consistently ask, what is it we can do to love ourselves so that we're not striking out at our neighbor? What is it that we can do to love our neighbors so that we're not striking out at ourselves? How can we do this in a way that brings mutual prosperity? We fail. In the midst of all of this, it gets really complicated really quickly. But our work is to strive for this love and this care and this concern, knowing every day that we're going to be engaging a world that is collapsing under its failure to live out this hope of love of self and love of neighbor. And so today, we're holding all that in prayer. Because today, I don't know if we have a solution, except to know that there is this hope. There are these times, there are these places where we find those 2 feet, sets of feet, sharing a kiddie pool, like Mr. Rogers pointed out to us. There's something underneath there we can long for and grasp for and talk with and seek out. And also know fully our own capacity to maintain the very types of systems of pain and trauma we see playing out elsewhere in the world. And that their work for peace is our work for peace, is God's work for peace. Amen.